Starting us. Thank you, Julie.
We've got Mr. Burbidge on the line.
Okay, Mr. Burbidge, welcome. Stephen Daish here, the chair of the hearings panel, and my colleague, Commissioner Littlejohn. You'll see on the other screen. So if you're ready to go, just turn your video and speaker on, and we'll take your submission.
Cool. Okay. Let's get the video rolling. Video. Okay, fantastic. Nice to see everybody available. Thank you for welcoming me on board the format to make a submission regarding what I have known in my experience as short stay accommodation. For your proposed plan, residential visitor accommodation. So I've worked as a compliance officer in the development and building space for local government in Western Australia for the last 20 years. And it would be fair to say I've got a little bit of in-depth knowledge as far as the operation and compliance aspects of residential visitor accommodation. I'm just going to try and bring up what I sent through to Julie this morning, because it basically details what I wanted to say. I just hope that my video keeps rolling here.
So we've received an email from you, Terry, along with an appendix planning policy from the city of Joondalup. So maybe be good to start. Tell us where Joondalup is.
Right.
Yes. I take it.
The city of Joondalup is a metropolitan local government authority, part of Perth metropolitan area. It's got a population of roughly 170,000 people, and it's about 10 k's north of CBD, Perth CBD.
Yeah, some of those beautiful beaches, I presume.
Yeah, great holiday spots and lots of short-term accommodation operating alongside of hotels and motels and the like.
Yep.
So in that governance area, all land use or activity required the approval of the local government. The only exception to activity approval was essentially a single residential property on residential land. So everything else that you wanted to do, every other activity or consent required an application and assessment by local government. And short stay accommodation was no exception to that rule. So some of the things that the planning officers would consider in that space was, or the main concern was amenity, residential amenity being preserved, because holiday accommodation guests don't have a tie into the local community or to nearby neighbours for that matter. They come for the sole purposes of holiday, and consequently they don't have the same inhibitions that standard residents have when they're visiting areas and especially in accommodation. So one of the main problems that we experienced was noisy parties, over-accumulation of rubbish, light spill, noise, car movements, too many cars attending the site. So there was a whole lot of controls put into the assessment process as per the attachment that I've provided to ensure that residential amenity was maintained for those ratepayers and long-term tenants who were living in those residential areas. Yeah, I won't labour the point, but essentially the controls that were put in place were an operational plan had to be lodged by the proponent. That was assessed by the local government. The approvals granted for 12 months, or consents were granted for 12 months, and by doing that, the local government then had the ability to not renew the consent should too many complaints be received about a particular residential visitor accommodation, short stay accommodation premises. The definition of short stay accommodation was any premises that was let out for a period of 3 months or less. Once it became over 3 months, it was just a standard residential letting situation. So in the main, it grabbed everything that was advertised on stays, on Book a Batch, on Airbnb, those sort of formats. We had situations where people were starting up and operating this sort of accommodation without the approval of the local government. And so we contacted the advertising formats and said, look, this isn't really on. Can you make sure that the people that are advertising on your sites have the correct approvals? And essentially, the advertising formats just didn't want to know. They were getting their money from the property owners. They didn't want to be involved in any form of governance at all. There were some good operators out there that took their responsibilities seriously when they were renting out their properties for short stay accommodation. They're pretty hands-on control, but others didn't. And where they didn't, that's normally where the problems arose. And without a governance by local government over this form of accommodation, it can really get out of hand. I'm not against short stay accommodation or residential visitor accommodation really, but from my experience, some 20 years in this space, I do realise that there's a good need for local government's oversight by way of planning application and monitoring and the big stick of either prosecution or not renewing approvals. That's basically it.
Thank you very much, Terry. I'll see if Commissioner Littlejohn has some questions first.
There we go. I found my mute. No, I found that really interesting. The whole visitor accommodation debate has gone on in New Zealand as places have become much more popular. Queenstown was another big spot where that happened. It's quite interesting to see that our big cousins over the Tasman have the same sorts of issues and have been working out strategies to deal with it as well. So no, that's very helpful. I appreciated the attachments too, because they do very much highlight the ground I think that we're all working on here in terms of amenity impacts, which I think was probably the thing that was fueling council's concern from the outset. But yeah, no, very interesting. No questions though. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So Terry, I take it you're now domiciled in New Plymouth?
Yes.
Yes. Is that home or are you just...
I grew up here. Yeah, I was raised here, but I've been away for near on 40 years and came back last year.
Okay, it's a lovely spot to come back to. We've certainly been enjoying our time when we get to travel. Yes, look, I don't have any questions either. I think the policy that you've given us from John Dulup or June Dulup, very interesting, and I'm sure we'll have a good look at that and while we're making our decisions. We don't have any evidence apart from yours relating to these amenity effects per se. I'm just wondering whether you had any specific examples in New Plymouth that you could pinpoint for us?
In New Plymouth, no. I have heard anecdotally that similar sort of issues can occur with lack of on-site car parking. That was a big planning requirement over in WA that visitor accommodation, they definitely need on-site parking. They don't want overspill onto verges and other parking areas. So if you want to operate your home or a premises that you bought as short stay accommodation, then you provide sufficient car parks on there for the people that are attending.
Okay, that's very interesting. I don't have any further questions. Very much appreciate your the time and effort to put your submission in, your summary email, and coming and talking to us today. It is a key part of our process, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Nice to meet you, Kit, and thanks, Julie.
See ya.
Bye.
You're welcome to stay, of course, if you want to, but you got to go back to work, I think, don't you?
I will hang on just for a little bit, and if there's any other submissions being made, I will listen to them for a bit. Thank you very much, Stephen.
We're hearing from Kaingaora next, so yes. So that moves us to you, Bal and Michael.
It's working again. Hello.
I thought you weren't showing up.
No, I'm just here to hold Michael's hand and make sure he doesn't sell the house while he's here. No, I don't have any particular comments from a legal perspective. Obviously, I reviewed Mr. Campbell's evidence. I'll just make 2 points, I suppose. One, from a legal perspective, if there's a matter of discretion that says extent of and effect of, then in my submission, that means 2 different things. Because somebody looking at that matter of discretion would say, well, clearly we're meant to look at 2 different things, both the extent of and effect of. And then the second point I'd make is that depending on the factual situation, you could have a large infringement with no effect, and Mr. Campbell gave that example of a height in relation to boundary against a reserve. Or alternatively, you could have a very small infringement with a large effect if the height in relation to boundary was immediately adjacent to someone's outdoor area, and that's the only outdoor area that they get in it, and it removes a lot of afternoon sun. So I guess the key message there is that you could answer both of those questions by looking at effects. And if you look at infringement only, extent of infringement, you could end up with quite a different outcome. So in my submission, the key is the effect. The only rationale that seemed to be raised in the 42A report was consistency in the plan, and I agree there should be the same phraseology, and I know Kaingaora has submitted on other provisions as well. And then the only other rationale seemed to be a reference to permitted baseline in the 42A report, which I didn't really understand because this isn't a permitted activity, it's an RDA. And in any event, the analysis is on the effect, not the extent of infringement. And obviously we are saying it's the extent of the effect that should be considered, not the extent of the infringement. And the only time extent of infringement is generally relevant that I've seen in a rule, and I think Auckland might have this, Mr. Campbell will know, but sometimes they'll have a rule that says if you're 20% over or more, then you trip into a discretionary activity, for example, or something like that. So in those circumstances, you can have an RDA up to 20% and then more than 20%. And in those circumstances, obviously the extent of infringement is relevant. But here there's none of that activity threshold issue that arises. So they're just those are my comments from a legal perspective. But Mr. Campbell, do you want to? I'm happy to answer any questions, or Mr. Campbell can briefly speak to his evidence. It's fairly short too, I thought.
Thanks, Bal. I've just double checked that the commissioners can hear me.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Great.
Good. Michael, just before you kick off, we did hear from Jamie at the start of the hearing when she introduced her 42A report. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can, Commissioner.
Yeah, so Jamie mentioned that this wording does appear throughout the plan. So I think she's going to listen quite carefully to what you have to say, and then perhaps have a chat with the wider district plan team about the plan-wide issues with this particular wording. So that was just an intro.
Sure.
Yeah.
And apologies, I wasn't able to sit on the opening submissions. I actually had another discussion with New Plymouth just on other topics, so that was really helpful. Mr. Madsen has actually sort of taken a bit of my limelight with his summary, and so my summary is very brief, and effectively this evidence just relates to one issue, but it's an issue that does, as you indicate, it cuts across the plan in terms of its approach with the use of the extent of, and so in my evidence, as I've set out, I think the use of the wording extent of in those range of assessment criteria that are used throughout the plan and the zones in particular is inappropriate and indeed unnecessary. And I set that in my evidence, and Mr. Matheson has sort of covered some of the key points, so I wasn't proposing to restate that. And I have put this evidence in other areas, and we'll continue as we come up to other topics in terms of the residential section in particular, where this is sort of carried out throughout. So yeah, look, I'm happy to answer any questions really. If there's any other matters you'd like to clarify, and it's set out in my evidence. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I don't have any questions. Your evidence, as usual, is very clear. And I'll certainly like the way you use examples as you do. That's very helpful for us. Kat and I, we're both sitting on the residential chapters too, so we'll obviously see evidence from you on that as well. But I'll hand over to Kit to see whether he has any questions.
Yeah. Hello, Mr. Campbell and Mr. Matheson. No, I don't have any particular question. I think it's a valid point you've raised, and it's sort of because it goes back to very much an argument I would have had years and years ago whenever an application for consent was somehow non-complying or there was a rule infringement, the fact of the infringement was translated as an effect on the environment, which I always struggled with back then. Not everyone agreed with me, but the world has moved on. And I mean, I do accept your point that you're not saying that use of the phrase extent of is inappropriate in all situations. It's just that when you're being asked to consider the extent of deviation from the permitted standard as a separate exercise to effect, you're actually asking for a whole different thing. So
That's right.
I take your point, and I mean there are other examples of assessment, well, just these sorts of criteria where the extent of is used, but it's quite specific to what the extent of the thing is that you're being asked to think about. So
that's correct, and I looked at a couple of plans, including Auckland, but also some of the second generation plans, and the use of the extent to which of a certain issue is quite common terminology, and I think wholly appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, I measure it to some extent against the only statutory restricted matters that I've been able to find, and those are in the wonderfully clear and helpful National Environmental Standards for Freshwater. And they have section 56 in the regulation. They do set out matters of discretion, and the phrasing they use is not dissimilar to what we see here. The extent to which the nature, scale, timing, intensity, and location of the activity may have adverse effects on various things, or the extent to which the adverse effects will be managed to avoid loss of natural wetlands. So they're all pretty straightforward, but no similar sort of one, the extent to which the activity deviates from the permitted regulation, for example. You wouldn't see that in this document.
Right.
Have you gone through and done the exercise that I think might be the real concern for the council in terms of all of the assessment criteria in the plan, and identified those that could keep extent and those that could not, based on your analysis?
We did identify a number in addition to this topic in the residential and commercial zone section. I would suggest I would suggest it's possibly not comprehensive. There may be some gaps, but I guess we picked up the ones that we were looking at. I can't categorically say I've gone through every part.
Okay.
There may be the odd one.
Well,
An example is, I think, in the low density zone, we may not have had a submission there, which is why I've only identified the general residential zone and medium residential zone.
Well, I mean, regardless.
Yes.
No, I was just going to say that the panel are alive to this, and certainly as we're progressing through our recommendations, we've sort of set aside a section there to deal with this, cases where there are assessment criteria, and all of the evidence we're hearing about them will all sort of be brought to bear on those sorts of considerations.
Thank you.
All right, but nothing further. Thank you, Mr. Campbell. Thank you, Mr. Matheson.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bal and Michael. Jamie, I think it's probably perhaps in your court with the rest of the planning team to track down where this word's extent is used in tandem with effects through the other chapters, as you signalled at the start. So that's something that's on your list anyway. Are you ready to go in terms of a brief written right of reply? I'm sorry, verbal right of reply, Jamie?
Yes, I am. Yep, I can get started now if you like.
Yes, thank you.
So my name is Jamie Marie Cannon, and I'm the author of the Section 42A report for residential visitor accommodation. This is my verbal right of reply based on the written and oral evidence presented by submitters on the residential visitor accommodation topic. I intend to expand on these matters and my recommendations in the written right of reply. Today, we have heard from a number of submitters, most of whom are in support of the recommendations provided in my Section 42A report. While we have heard from one submitter, Terry Barbich, who is not supportive of the Section 42A recommendations, the majority of evidence we have heard indicates that in the New Plymouth context, residential visitor accommodation is not adversely affecting residential character and amenity to the extent that warrants additional regulation through the district plan standards. For this reason, I maintain my position and generally stand by the recommendations provided in my Section 42A report. I will now make comment on some of the more specific matters that have been raised by submitters. The first one is Kāinga Ora's comment around the reference to extent and effect of non-compliance in matters of discretion. Kāinga Ora remains concerned that use of the word extent within the matters of discretion may conflate the effects of a non-compliance with the degree or extent of infringement. Kāinga Ora considers it as inappropriate and unnecessary for the matter of discretion to refer to both the extent of non-compliance and the effect of non-compliance, because the focus should be on the effect of the breach rather than the degree of the breach. And if an infringement has an effect, the phrase effect of non-compliance is sufficiently broad to encompass all relevant effects that need to be considered. I understand the points being made by Kāinga Ora and do agree that the matter of discretion needs to be reconsidered. However, I am very conscious that any recommendation on this matter does have plan-wide implications. To achieve consistency in terminology throughout the plan, any recommendation will lead to consequential amendments to all other matters of discretion throughout the zones. I need some time to discuss this matter with the district plan team, so at this stage I reserve my position on that matter. In terms of relationships between definitions and rules, Johnston Resource Management Limited has highlighted where various wording changes could be made to help clarify the intent of the recommended provisions, to provide technical accuracy or remove potential duplication across provisions, which I support. In particular, Helen Johnson has suggested combining the rules for residential visitor accommodation and visitor accommodation where the rules have the same status within a zone, amendments to rules to address duplication between permitted activity rules for sensitive activities, visitor accommodation and residential visitor accommodation within the town and centre zones, and reconsidering the recommended exclusion of residential visitor accommodation from the definition of living activities due to potential unintended consequences. In relation to this matter, my recommendation to exclude residential visitor accommodation from the definition of living activities was in response to Airbnb's submission, and the intent was to clearly differentiate between living activities and residential visitor accommodation activities. Helen Johnson has highlighted some potential issues with this recommendation and considers it important that residential visitor accommodation activities are subject to the same rules as living activities used in other plan chapters of the proposed district plan, specifically to provide a similar level of amenity and character to that which would be expected for normal residential use. To ensure that design standards that apply to living activities also apply to buildings used for residential visitor accommodation, such as minimum setbacks from wind turbines in the energy chapter and compliance with noise insulation requirements. And to ensure that the rules for living activities which seek to manage reverse sensitivity effects on already established activities include residential visitor accommodation activities. I generally agree with Helen Johnson's comments and suggestions, which are useful and pragmatic. In reality, most residential units used for residential visitor accommodation will also be used for living activities. Upon reflection, my initial view is that it's not necessary for these definitions to be mutually exclusive. I will review these matters in detail and provide a recommendation to reconcile these duplications or potential unintended consequences in my written right of reply. I do note that because these matters are primarily plan structure or plan mechanics type matters, any recommended amendments in response will not change the overall intent of my Section 42A recommendations in response to other submissions. Lastly, the application of the general effect standards. So Airbnb considers that the current wording of the permitted activity standard does not make it clear that the general effect standards only apply to new residential units or new minor residential units. Commissioner Daish has requested that Airbnb provide some suggested wording for me to consider. I understand the point being made by Airbnb and will consider how the intent can be made clearer. However, I do note that this point is not unique to residential visitor accommodation. There may be other situations where the use of existing residential buildings for certain permitted uses for certain activities is permitted, such as home business or supported residential care, whereas many of the effect standards are only applicable to new or extended buildings. I need to discuss this matter with the reporting officers for the zones, and I will provide my response in the written right of reply. That's all, unless there's any other questions from the panel.
Not from me, Jamie. That's short and sweet. I'll see if Kit's got any clarifications.
No, all very clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we'll look forward to your written right of reply, Jamie, and certainly look out for those suggested wording from Denton's regarding that last matter.
Yeah.
So with that, this concludes hearing 15A related to visitor residential accommodation, and we will. I think we're back next week for commercial is the next one, commercial and town centre matters with Commissioner McMahon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. See you, Stephen.
Thank you.
See you, Zurli.
Bye.
See ya.